Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson. The woman that I have brought to discuss with you today is a woman whose name is Nataliya Goncharova. Chances are that unless you're Russian or have a very inclusive history in art, you probably have not heard her name any more than she would have heard your name. However, you have an advantage. I'm going to share with you her life. She won't have that opportunity to learn about yours. But her life is quite fascinating, and I bring her to you because she is a premier woman Russian artist. And she is ranked with the likes of Georgia O'Keeffe and Mary Cassatt, and yes, her paintings sell for just as much. So I think she's going to be well worth an hour's worth of your time. So pour yourself some coffee, sit back, relax, and enjoy my stories and your introduction to a wonderful woman artist whose name is Nataliya Goncharova. Her artwork is classified as neo-primitivism. Now, neo-primitivism is not the same as work done by the primitive artist Grandma Moses. Neo-primitivism is a Russian art movement, and she will actually initiate that. Let's take a look at some information about her. First of all, here's her work. That's her self-portrait. She uses very bold colors. You'll enjoy that. You will find, as with many artists, like last week's with Marc Chagall, everything in her painting is relevant. There's some reason for why it's there. Here she's standing in front of her paintings because she is an artist, and she's holding what she considered to have been yellow lilies. She will have grown up, and I'll show you some examples of her community, around peasants, and she will have an affinity all of her life for folk art. She uses creative perspective and does some takeoffs on Cubism, just as Cezanne did when you studied him. And she also uses a technique called futurism. And if you're not comfortable with this word, don't worry. Before the hour's up, you will be. Now, this is a photograph of her as a young woman. And because you have a background in Russian history, she was born the same year that Alexander II was assassinated along the canal in St. Petersburg. That was the same year that Picasso was born. So it was an important year. She was born on an estate in the Tula province. This Tula province is an area that's about 120 miles southwest of Moscow, and it is north, 200 or 300 miles north of Chernobyl, which I mentioned when I talked about Russian history. Her father was a very famous architect and a really astounding mathematician. And her family also had come from money, and it included some Orthodox priests in her background. Her great uncle was Alexander Pushkin. Pushkin is considered by the Russians to be one of their favorite and most important poets. I like this picture. It just reminded me of where she would have walked as a young girl. She loved art, she loved music, she liked reading, and she also enjoyed folk art. And she liked to watch the peasants because there was a plethora of them there working in the fields. And she also, because of her family's background in the Russian Orthodox Church, she had a very strong affinity for religious icons, and she will use those in her paintings, and I'll point some of those out for you. These are some examples of where she lived. That's the Tula area. And if we go back in time, it was Peter the Great who first made this an important area for ancient Russia because it was where he established his first armament factory. Right now, in today's world, This area is famous for creating or manufacturing samovars. During the years of Stalin, of course, he is going to include an important public building and a statue of Lenin to remind people they are part now, not of Russia, but of the USSR. And Lenin, I'm not too sure how happy he would have been to have had his sculpture there, because he didn't really find the Tula people to be too much to his liking. He said they wouldn't fix their guns for free, which I don't have a problem with that myself, but it was one of the reasons why he said the Tula people are just not like the rest of us. This is where Nataliya Goncharova will go to school. The family, his father's architectural business kind of fell off, and so in 1891 they moved to Moscow. He had graduated from this very same school. It's the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. And in that day and age, it was one of the two largest schools in Russia. St. Petersburg Academy of Art, you're familiar with that, I would like to think, because that's where Marc Chagall went. So these two artists that we've talked about this past two times have both come from esteemed universities and received their education there. She left the school in 1909, and the reason for that? In that day and age, Russian women were not permitted degrees. They could study. They could study with the men. They could study just as hard. They worked just as hard for their grades, but they were not given degrees. So at the end of 1909 or thereabouts, she left the school. This is a 2-for-1 group today. You're going to learn a little bit about this man, Mikhail Larionov, and Larionov is her boyfriend. He will have been born exactly 1 month ahead of her in 1881. And they will have met in art school. And they will stay together until the day that she dies, because she precedes him in death. He was kind of a radical guy. He was a good artist. He was not as exceptional as she, but he had very, very unusual ideas, and sometimes he expressed them in class and he would be expelled. So that happened to him 3 times. He did not end up with a degree. But he will be the first one to encourage Nataliya to paint and not sculpt. You see, she had entered the university to become a sculptress. And she had actually won a silver medal for a piece of sculpture that she entered in a show during her years there at the university. But he sees in her an ability to paint. He's a painter, and he wants her to do that. In fact, when he has suggested it to her, she got a little bit upset with him and didn't speak to him for about 3 days. And then she finally got in touch with him and she said, okay, come over and take a look at what I've done. And when it went over, she had about 15 paintings that she had done that were inspired by him wanting her to paint and not sculpt. And it will be her painting career that will make a name for her. She will go with him to travel with the ballet company, the Russian ballet company. They will be in Switzerland, they will be in Italy, they will be in France, they will be in different places. And she will tour with the company. She will do set designs, and he will do some work on the sets, but he also was good at set construction as well. When he left Russia in 1915, he never went back. I mean, he never went back there to live. I won't say he never went back ever, but certainly not to live again. And he and she will both settle permanently in Paris in 1919. Now you're familiar with 1917 and 1905 and all of the upheavals that were going on during the lifetime of Nicholas II before he was assassinated, which was in 1918. So now in 1919, they're taking a look at all of this, and it was during the First World War, and they said, better that we aren't there now. So they permanently settled in Paris, and they will eventually become citizens. He's an organizer, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted you to know about him. He will organize shows, he will exhibit in those shows, but he is very good at bringing people together and getting them organized to present exhibits. And he does one of those in Moscow in 1928. They will both become French citizens, and it will be because, now the two of them are together, if you can follow this, but he ends up having a girlfriend who you'll learn about, and she ends up with a boyfriend. And the boyfriend has international connections, and in 1938, he could see where things were getting very hot and touchy in Germany and other parts of Europe, and he said to them, you might want to apply for French citizenship, because they all four of them knew each other. They do that, they become citizens, and so then during the occupation of the Nazis in Paris, they're really not disturbed. They move to the country to get away from the noise and all the upheaval and opportunity for better food, but they are not recognized as Russians. They're recognized by the Germans as French citizens. He won't die until he's 82 years old, and again, he stayed in Paris all his life. Of the two, Goncharova is, by historians' evaluation, considered to be the better artist. And here's another picture of Mikhail. He will found, because he's an organizer, they found several different groups. I'm only going to bring out two of them today for you. If you research him, you'll find that there are more. The first one that he came up with was a title for an exhibition, and they had these for 2 years. It was called the Jack of Diamonds. Why that? Well, the Jack of Diamonds is kind of a rascal. He's kind of crazy and wild, and in the deck of cards, that's what he's seen as. And so Mikhail thought that would be a great name for their first exhibition. They will also have an exhibition for a couple of years called The Donkey's Tale, and you'll find the story about that, which is coming along soon, to be rather amusing. When they held lectures or exhibits, they would have to plan these things, and they would meet in cafes, and they would discuss their new ways of creating art. They were trying to get away. They're trying to separate themselves from European art, because he had been in Paris in 1901, and he had come back and had told Nataliya all about what he had seen there. And she had tried some examples of the work that he had imagined for her. And they are meeting in a cafe one night. And they decide that they will just paint tattoo-like designs on everybody's faces. Well, that got very wild and crazy, and before it was over, the police had to be called to get the party stopped. And Goncharova was one of the people that was hauled off to the police station. She didn't end up in jail, but she did, if you want to call her having a record, that would be her record. They had always hoped that eventually they could establish a Russian school of modern art. Well, you know enough about what happened after the USSR was formed and the upheavals and the difficult times that the Russian people were going through. And this dream of theirs just became completely an impossibility. It will be 1950 until he suffers a very serious stroke. And that will pretty much end his working years. It's very debilitating for him. I'll repeat some of this again later on when I show some other examples of work in his life, their lives. But they would be together over 50 years. Remember, they met in 1901 at the Moscow University, and finally in 1995 they will marry. They have lived together for a number of years. Even though he had a girlfriend and he would go off with her and she had a boyfriend, they still considered themselves to be very best friends. And in June of 1955, they finally do marry for convenience of the state's sake. This photograph is interesting because if you'll notice, she looks interesting for that time period. She shocked women and men in Moscow when she would put on a man's hat and she would borrow a pair of Mikhail's pants, and she would put those on and she would strut around town, and they called that cross-dressing. So many of you are sitting there listening to this lecture right now, and you're sitting in a pair of slacks. Well, in the early 1900s, that would be considered cross-dressing. There is an example of what they did to each other's faces and the faces of their friends at the cafe that got her arrested. And yes, they would do this to themselves and then walk around the streets of Moscow just to notice the shock appeal. When they had gone back, when they were in Moscow or when they were in Russia, he was drafted into the service for a while, but he was badly wounded and spent 3 months in a hospital in Moscow. And so he was released from the hospital, and that's when he started his experiments and his work with art. Here's an example of his work. Now that looks rather primitive, neo-primitive by Russian standards. He often used his own personal experiences for his paintings. He liked to ride horses. He had served in the army, and there you see an army person on the back of a horse. Now, as I mentioned to you before, he had traveled to Europe and to France in 1901, and he had seen the work that was being done by the French Impressionists. And this is a piece that he did, and I've often wondered if he had stuck with that style, if he might not have had a greater influence on Russian art than he did, and what he had was certainly estimable. But that, I think, is a beautiful example of Impressionism. This is a painting that Goncharova did of Mikhail, because Mikhail is in the service, and there he is. It looks as though he's wounded himself. And this man back here, his head is bandaged. Everything in her paintings means something. So when you have time, if you do, to look at other examples of her work, look into them. There are soldiers there are tents there. It's the spring of the year. The flowers are blooming on the trees. Now Nataliya, or Natasha, I will use the names interchangeably, was certainly influenced by what Mikhail had shown or had talked to her about, and then what she had seen when they had traveled with the ballet company. And here you see an example of one of her favorite French artists, which was Paul Gauguin. Remember when I talked about Gauguin, I talked about how his feet on his figures were often very large. Look at the feet on the washerwoman that Goncharova does. And she will consistently do this throughout her career, to make the feet large. The Germans have been moving ahead with their art as well at the same time, and they have developed a school called the Blue Rider School, of which Goncharova is a very early member. And the Blue Rider School, example here is by the artist Franz Marc, they use color with abandon. And they just created these wonderful, wonderful, colorful pieces. But then, of course, you look at what Gauguin has done, and he has done the same thing, but only in his own style. This is one that Goncharova did called Planting Potatoes. Early on, I mentioned to you that she grew up in Tula on an estate. She used to watch the women working in the fields, and if you notice, all of these women have different duties. Some of them are digging potatoes, some of them are bagging potatoes, some of them are looking up at the sky. You could just see each one of them doing something completely different and clear into the background. This is considered to be Russian neo-primitivism. And that's the style of painting that she did when she worked like this, but she will work other ways as well. I think it's an interesting fact to remind you of that I remember when I discussed Mary Cassatt with you being in France and how difficult it was for women. She and Berthe Morisot both fought for their position in society as women artists. Well, in Russia, that was not the case. About half of the artists that were working during the time of Goncharova were women. So establishing herself as a woman artist was no problem at all. Establishing herself as an artist was the challenge. Here are two examples of work done by Goncharova and by Larionov. You see his painting up here, and you see hers down here. And as I said, she is considered by art historians to be the finer of the two artists. Notice this piece that she also did of a still life. And also notice that everything that she does has a lot of detail in it. Look at the work that she's put on the edge of that towel. He hasn't bothered to do much of anything to the front of this bottle of Benedictine, but she is very particular and makes sure that everything that is in her paintings is important for you to see. She did a whole series of sunflowers. This is one that she did in 1910, and I have to admit this is my favorite piece of all of the work that she did. This is called Peacock in Bright Sunlight. Now I want you to notice where the peacock's head is. This, of course, is his tail feathers, and then come down here, follow the pointer around, and there is his head. And the feathers on the top of his head unite with some of these that go behind. But I just love that piece. I just think it's so imaginative. She also, again, did pieces that were related to her Russian Orthodox faith. And here you see a rabbi holding a cat. Religious persecution was rampant with the Jewish people and with many of the old believers. And here you see her statement about that in sympathy. Here are men marching in the background. And over here, notice, there is the hand of God. The hand of God is coming down to bless the rabbi. I love this piece. This is what Larionov did of Goncharova. And notice what's in this piece. He used collage. That's all of that lettering that you see back in there. A lot of that was pasted on. That's not painted on. He had pasted those pieces on, and then notice down here, just to make sure you remember that it is Natasha and she is an artist. There are her two little cups that she would have had vehicle in to work with her oil paint. There are her brushes, and her hand is sticking through her palette. So all of that is included as well. The first Jack of Diamonds show. Some of the artists that were in that show, along with Larionov, had been expelled from Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. And these are two examples of work that Goncharova put in that show. I will be discussing a little bit more about this style of painting, but do notice this Russian neo-primitivism here. And when you're looking at the figures, naturally you're going to see the large feet now, and you're going to see the two figures in the foreground. Don't forget about the shovel. Don't forget about the women marching in the background. Everything in her pictures makes sense. Some examples of what her work was, all of her work. All of her work was expressive. It was colorful and it was decorative. It made wonderful additions to any wall that it was hung on. This is a piece that Larionov did for the Jack of Diamonds show, and I used these two as laborers. He loved to paint men working, and here she is. Women are pulling the fish out of the net that the men have brought in. Notice that there are things going on in the background behind her. She would put 33 paintings in that early show. The two of them, along with their cadre of friends, were the first to scorn Russian reality. That's the kind of work that had been done, and that is the kind of work that will only be accepted after the USSR is established by artists who are working in Russia. And of course, these two are there then, but they will be leaving before too long to move to Paris. Now, the story of the donkey's tail. In Vermont, there was a cafe called the Agile Rabbit. And the Agile Rabbit was a place where all of the artists, Cezanne went there, Picasso went there, Matisse went there. They all went there if they could, because they just loved to be there and talk and chat and be with other artists. But this cafe proprietor decides that he can tie a paintbrush to the tail of his donkey and then dip it in paint, and interesting things might happen. Okay, here's the proprietor, and there is the donkey. The donkey's name is Lolo. Now, to help you get your bearings quickly, here we go. There is the painting. Behind Lolo, there is the proprietor. You see his beard? And he is feeding the donkey. You can see a carrot back here. The donkey loved to eat vegetables. And tied to the donkey's tail is a paintbrush. And here you can see in the foreground in this photograph, paintbrushes. Or paint cans, sorry. And somebody did a cartoon for in a magazine that shows Lolo the donkey with his tail swishing against the canvas doing a painting, and his owner with the beard holding on to him. This is Lolo's painting. It's called Sunset Over the Adriatic. And the donkey did that unbeknownst to itself in 1910. And Larionov decided that would make a great title for an exhibit. People came from all over the place to feed the donkey, dip his tail in paint, and then watch and see what happens. After they do the Jack of Diamonds show and the Donkey's Tail show, this pair became very, very, very important in Russian art in the Moscow area at that time, and they were flooded with commissions. So they were doing quite well. This is a piece that Goncharova did called The 12 Evangelists. Again, Russian Orthodox religion, her ancestors, and her personal interests in icons and in religion. And this is a piece that was exhibited at the Donkey's Tail show. Now, by our standards today, that doesn't look like it would be something that would be offensive, but it was. It was taken down. A critic came in. First of all, the critic was turned off by the title of the show called The Donkey's Tail, but then he found the four evangelists standing here with nothing on their scrolls, large feet, looking off in different directions, all wearing a different kind of clothing. And he said, this is just not, this is an Antichrist piece. This is not the way you treat a religious theme, and it should not be in a show that's called The Donkey's Tail. So he had that piece removed. It was not with her permission. There's another layer to this. Women artists were not supposed to paint icons. Those were done in monasteries by priests, by monks, not by Russian women in studios. So that was another big no-no in society to those that didn't understand what Nataliya Goncharova was all about. Last week I talked to you about Marc Chagall. He hung work in this show. And she hung over 50 pieces in that particular show. This is another one of her icons. Now take a look at this with me, because it has some interesting features. There's Matthew, whose symbol is the ox. There is Mark, whose symbol is the eagle. Down here is Luke, whose symbol is the lion, and over to the other side is John, the other evangelist, whose symbol is the angel. And now notice how she keeps this position behind the head that identifies the evangelist. She keeps that all very similar, and she gives all of them wings. Also notice something else. She includes the sun and the moon. And when she worked on religious pieces, she did it with a great deal of respect and authenticity. She called her religious inspirations gifts from above. And because she was of the Orthodox tradition, and those of you who are familiar with icon painting well are aware that before an artist puts a single stroke on a canvas, they pray. And when she worked on this particular piece or any of the others, she prayed incessantly as she worked and as she applied paint, and she also fasted during the time that she was making those amazing pieces of work. Now let's fast forward to the year 2019. 2019. These two works are discovered in the former Czech Republic. They were in a villa. There was an art historian, a student who was working on a degree, who decided to research her work and to research the work she'd done with icons. And there were some pieces that seemed to have been mentioned, but he couldn't find. So he did some extra deep digging, and he found that these two pieces were done around 1915, 1916, with Goncharova and with Larionov. You couldn't always depend upon the date that they applied to the back of the painting for when it was done, because early on they had decided that if they made the paintings look like they were done earlier, that they would be held in higher esteem. I don't think that really made much difference as time went on, but that was their modus operandi at that time. Goncharova had a friend whose last name was Zakova. Zakova was married to a Russian who was a diplomat, and Zakova met Natasha while she was working with the ballet, and in this time frame, and they become very, very good friends. Well, then she finds that Zakova has developed tuberculosis, and Zakova is in and out of one sanitarium after another, and Zakova only lives to be 38 years old. And in the process, Natasha's doing everything she can to try to support her. So, of course, she's going to create icons for her. And if you look at the one, it's of Christ. You'll notice that Christ has a curl in the middle of his forehead. Well, what is that about? That is about the fact that she is showing you that this is not an ancient icon. This is an icon done in 1915, 1916, but this is done for her friend as a way to give her support. Also, the larger piece was actually a whole lot of small pieces all put together on one surface. These were found in a closet in a villa. He went back through the history of the prevalence of pieces of work, and these two had fallen off the radar, and finally got himself to the former Czech Republic and found the villa and went in, and they dug around, and sure enough, there were those pieces. It was a great day of rejoicing in the art world. I said everything has meaning for him, or for her work. There are the fish up here, the fisher of men. Here are salamanders that can rebirth themselves if a part is lost. The fawn represents the longing for Christ. And on the other side, you have the pelicans. And the pelicans have a tendency to pluck at the feathers on their own breasts to draw blood to feed the very, very young. And that's what that represents. I'll show you another example of this because it's really so significant and so new to the world. Here we have Mark. And this time notice that the interpretation for the symbols, the lion, the eagle, the angel, they are changed. Goncharova will change her statements, but these paintings, as you now are well aware, have deep religious meaning because all of these pieces were all done individually, and then this was all mounted on one large surface so she could present it to her ailing friend. She and Mikhail will come up with some new ways to paint, some interesting avant-garde kinds of ways. The Italians had started a technique called futurism, which meant showing motions in space. And you can see here where she's trying to show you that this bicyclist is moving, and none of the motion lines are ahead of the bicycle. They are all behind, so that it's logical. Rayonism is another technique that they come up with after a lot of discussion with their friends. They decide that they would like to try to paint without form. Now, how do you do that? Well, you have to work, that's called cats. You'll see why in a minute. You have to work by breaking up the form with rays of light. So wherever light hits something, it's spattered a ray. Rayonism. So no concrete forms in Rayonism, but lots of motion. This was their first attempt at Russian abstract art. And you can see that it is motion and it's reflective light. And what's in that painting? Where are the cats? Well, there are two. There are two black cats in that piece, and there is a tabby in the middle. I leave it to you to come up with exactly who is who and where each one is, but it's certainly, as just abstract work, it's certainly a very fascinating piece and an interesting statement. Here are the two of them in the theater. This is when she and he were working with the theatrical designs and traveling with the ballet. They will do that until he dies in 1929. And until that time, they have lived well. They have traveled, they have been paid well. Their lives have been exciting and interesting, and they've met a number of very important people. But after Digilev's death, it will become more difficult for them, to the extent that she will feel responsible for helping to support them. And one of the things that she does is she designs fashions for shows in Paris and also shows in Moscow. And I'll show you an example of one of those in the next slide. But she also had friends who were writing books, so she illustrated those, and she would also give painting classes in her apartment. This is one of her stage designs. This is for Firebird. And Firebird it's a story, and it's a Russian folktale. Here you can see the coach bringing the person for the coronation that will be held back inside here. Out here are people looking out windows, and there is the public down here. And this would be just like with the work done by Marc Chagall. It would be a huge backdrop of scenery for what was going on in the play. Here are some of her costumes for the play, here and here. And because it's a Russian folktale, of course, they're going to be dressed in Russian folk-like costumes. But when she designed fashions for Moscow or for Paris, she often would also incorporate the suggestion of the Russian peasant in her work. After World War II, after the end of the German occupation in Paris, Larionov's personal life just started to fall apart. These are two early portraits that he had done of himself. This one has, there's Larionov, there's his last name right there in Russian. But you can see down here some of his paintings and things around him. This is while he was still in his heydays. But by this time, by 1950, he is living with his girlfriend. His girlfriend's name is Alexandria Tomalina. And they are in London, and she is working there, and he is staying with her, and he has a very severe stroke. Alexandria calls Natasha on the phone and says, you might want to come and see him. I don't know how long he's going to live. So Natasha goes over, takes a look at him, and one thing leads to another, and she brings him back to Paris and has him interred in a care facility for people with severe stroke conditions. They will get married. He will survive. He actually lives longer than she, but they will get married in 1955, even though he still has this girlfriend. You'll see a little bit more about this in the next slide. But they will get married because they want to have control over what they have painted, what they have collected. So they know that whoever survives will be able to make the final decision. It won't be taken from them when they die. It will be moved on to the survivor. She will die 7 years after they get married. That's in 1962. And he dies in 1964. This is where they lived in Paris. This is where they lived. They lived there, he or she lived there the whole time. There is her studio. It's kind of a mess, but it's not the worst that you've seen in these presentations I've given you. But she would live there and she would die there. She would live there her entire life. And look at the size of the work that she is creating here. There they are as an older couple, a little different from the one you saw of them sitting in the theater. And there they are with some of their earlier rayon paintings that they had done with the use of light and the destruction of form. Goncharova was not a housekeeper, and she was not a good cook. She didn't like to cook. She said she would work to put a whole meal together, people would eat it, walk out, and then come back in a couple of hours and be hungry again. It seemed like a waste of her time. She would clean the apartment, and the next couple of weeks it would get all cluttered and dirty, and she'd have to clean it again. So she didn't find that to be a worthwhile use of her time, and so she chose to paint instead. Larionov's girlfriend, Alexandria, took an apartment in this same building. And she said, I'll cook and I'll clean. She wanted to be near him. That was his girlfriend. He wanted to be near her. But these two had shared and still continued to share an apartment. So he would spend a lot of time with Alexandria, but then at some point in the night, he would always come back upstairs to his own bed. Did Goncharova ever want to go back to Russia? You betcha. You betcha. She certainly did. She loved her motherland. She loved Russia. She had so much of what she painted reflected her time, her love, her history of that country. But it wasn't possible. Stalinism and what was going on, and at one point they did a clean sweep and killed or carted off to death camps professors and artists and anybody who could make political statements. So it was not a safe place for her to ever return to. In fact, she's buried in France. In 1957, she was thrilled to death when Russia launched Sputnik. And she would spend time for 3 years working on 20 paintings that had to do with the theme of outer space. It was her new theme. It was her new way of expressing herself. However, her last painting is done in 1960, and she dies 2 years later. What happens to her in between is this. She developed a very crippling condition of rheumatoid arthritis. It got to the point where she couldn't stand at the easel and raise her arm. She could only work if her arm was hanging down at her side. So they pulled a table over to her bed, and she would sit or lay on her bed, and she would reach over and get paint on her brush, and she would paint her canvases flat from her bed. Rheumatoid arthritis is not necessarily going to kill you, although it can certainly make life extremely difficult to live. She will get cancer, and in 1962 she does die, but she dies peacefully in her sleep in October. This is a painting that she did in 1909, and it sold in 2007 for $9.8 million. I told you, she ranks with Georgia O'Keeffe and Mary Cassatt. This is one which is kind of a Rayonistic piece that she did of flowers. That's a little bit more graphic. You can see flower shapes here. You can see vessels that the flowers would be in over here. And this one sold the next year in 2008 for $10.4 million. Now, why might you not know much about her? Well, she fell off the radar. She was just not well known for a number of years. And fortunately, and you'll see why, her work was still available. And when it came to light, museums said, wait a minute, I think we're missing something. We need to add her work to our collection. The Tate in London, the Metropolitan in New York City, they all clamored to Sotheby's and Christie's to bid on the work that comes up for sale. Her life is like her art. Look how colorful it is. Look at all of these wonderful pieces. And guess who was able to make her work available? Tom Alina, Alexandria, who had married Larionov 2 months before he died. She is living in Paris, and she is in their apartment. And she is very, very destitute. The first thing that she did, which was really a pretty big mistake, is that as soon as Goncharova died, she tried to move on and get rid of as much of Goncharova's work as she could, but there was still just an awful lot of it there. So when she couldn't barter anymore for food with it, she got in touch with the USSR. 1986, this is Gorbachev, this is Perestroika, this is Glasnost. She gets in touch with them and she said, I have work that was done by one of your famous women artists, Nataliya Goncharova, and also work done by her friend, Mikhail Larionov. I would like to give you everything that is in their apartment, with the understanding that you come, you take all of the work, everything you want from the apartment, it becomes yours, and it went to the Tretyakov Gallery, and the gallery can do with it from there on as they would like. But you give me a time to move back to Moscow. You afford me the opportunity to travel and to live in Moscow, and you will pay me. You will underwrite the costs for my living, just meager. She was an old woman. You will underwrite the costs for my living so that I can feel comfortable giving you all of this art and feel that I have done a favor to Larionov and also to Goncharova, but at the same time, you will take care of me. Alexandria Lua lived 1 year, 1987 is when she dies. But in the meantime, we have all of these examples of her still life, her futurism, her peasantry studies, her Rayonism, her icons. This is the expulsion from the garden. The angel pushing out Adam and Eve. And you can imagine, as Goncharova would have done that piece, praying, fasting, and paying before every single brushstroke was added. So, I would imagine you probably would ask yourself, why is she important to the art world today? I think I can help you with the answer to that question. She created many new and amazing images. I think you can agree with that. And she started many of the new art movements in Russia. Because the Iron Curtain was still down, because things were still difficult, even during the times of Gorbachev, they started to get better. But the Russians who were freed by the 1980s to the artists to paint were doing abstract things. At one point they tried to get me to sponsor an art exhibit here in the States of the work done by Russian artists, and they showed me this huge room with all of these different paintings. This was just a private group from the one of the ministries there. And there were some fine pieces. Now, was I familiar with her at the time? No, I wasn't either. Or Larionov? No, I wasn't. But I did see some fine work, and then I also saw some work that was rather helpless, and I wasn't sure which was which, and I also wasn't sure, because of the wars in Europe, I wasn't sure what work was stolen and what work actually belonged to whoever was showing me the group, so I opted to not get myself involved in that. However, look at what she did. Look at the vibrant colors, and of course, am I going to show you my favorite one, the peacock again? Of course I'm going to do that. And she rethought how to paint religious images. These images are from the 1900s, not from the Middle Ages, not from ancient Europe. This is modern, iconic painting. There are the peasants. She loved the peasants. She would spend time every day as a little girl going out into the fields, following them around, watching them empty the nets of the fish, watching them pick apples. She developed a Russian form of futurism, different from, but akin to, what the Italians had done. She and Laranov, she did a whole series on trees. Were there time, I would have showed you that series too. This is one of her forest statements, where she again takes trees and branches and leaves, foliage, and tries to abstract that down to simply light dancing off of shapes and no shapes. She is well known in the theatrical world for her expertise in stage design. And she also did many graphic pieces. This is St. George killing the dragon, and it's all in black and white, and it's a print, but it's also a very lovely piece. All this work done by this woman, very different styles, but yet there are common threads that run through all of it. This is a final picture of her favorite painting of herself. And there she is as a young woman. I think this is a lovely painting of the two of them in a Parisian cafe. Get her a little closer to you and let her float away. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make about today's program, you certainly can be in touch with Ask Presenter.
Yes.
And there are some, so please, what are they?
Okay, there was one question that came in. This resident is wondering why she's sometimes called both Natasha and Nataliya.
Because I have been to Russia too many times, and they do that. They will call themselves, if your name is Natasha, you could be called Nataliya. If your name is Nataliya, you could be called Natasha. It's like Sam and Samuel. It's like Robert and Bob. It's even closer than that. But it's just an interchange of the name, Natasha, Nataliya. It's the same name.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's take a look at what's coming next, because I have one more Russian artist for you to learn a little bit about. And this man's name is Anatoly Zerov. And Anatoly, sometimes when I talk about him, I'll call him Tolya, because that's the shortened name, that's the nickname for Anatoly. But Anatoly Zerov is a very, very important Russian artist. Here are two examples of his work. When you look at his work, you notice something about them. This one, for example, has what looks like burnt areas around it. He did not do that. You'll get the story on how that happened and why it happened next week. This is a self-portrait that he did, and I say here, he painted with paint and mustard and toothpaste. Wait until you see a little bit wait till you learn about his life, and wait till you learn about how he painted, where he painted, what he did. It's really a very, very fascinating story. And one of the special things about Anatoly Zerov is that in all of current day, the Russian Federation, there is one museum dedicated in Russia to one person, and that person is Anatoly Zerov, and that museum is in Moscow, and I will be showing you some examples from their exhibits as well. I think you'll find it to be fascinating. If you are interested in an advance handout for Zerov, please be in touch with Ask Presenter at willowvalley.org. And keep in mind that when I do the lecture, I present material to you. When I do the write-up that comes out in your bulletin, I add other material. And when I send handouts out for you, consider that to not be a repeat of what you're going to see. It's an enhancement. I am trying to use every possible avenue available to me to help to increase and enrich your cultural awareness. And even if it's as high as a mountain, perhaps I can just add a little bit each day that I meet with you. In the meantime, until I see you next week with Tolya Zerov, have a good week, be safe, and God bless. Thank you.